This is Arthur Inman, and he's sitting in the middle of a dark room and holding the microphone in front of him and talking into it and not knowing what on earth he's going to say, but saying it on as fast as he can.
Strange happenings in Boston's Garrison Hall.
This is Arthur Inman, and he's sitting in the middle of a dark room.
Mary Richardson takes us inside Arthur Inman's dark, disturbed mind. Who was this recluse who admired fascists and pretty young women?
Oh, Annie dear.
Yet this Harvard professor finds redemption in the diary Inman left behind.
I came to see him as a man who had his own kind of courage and his own peculiar genius.
In Florida, Mary tracks down one of Inman's young visitors and wonders whether his life is about to become as famous as he'd wished.
I think it would make a wonderful movie, and I think it would make a wonderful soap opera.
The Inman Diaries, next on Chronicle.
This is the story of one of Boston's most unusual citizens ever, a man you've probably never heard of. His name was Arthur Inman, and he lived here in this South End building for over 40 years, until the year 1963, when he put a bullet through his head.
Arthur Inman was 68 years old when he died. This is also the story of another man, Professor Daniel Aaron, who at the age of 92 is still on the English faculty at Harvard. He never met Arthur Inman, yet the two men's stories are deeply intertwined. That's because Professor Aaron spent 10 years of his life reading, then editing, what is possibly the longest diary ever written. 155 volumes, 17 million words. The bizarre diary of Arthur Inman.
I think he wanted to be famous. I think he wanted to write a book that nobody else had written. He was very much attracted to success.
As the only son of an extremely wealthy family from Atlanta, Arthur Inman was expected to succeed. But halfway through college in Pennsylvania, he suffered a breakdown.
He describes it very graphically in the diary, that he simply collapsed. It could no longer function. It was both physical and mental.
For the rest of his life, Inman was plagued by dozens of ailments, both real and imagined. While he was still a young man, he married Evelyn Yates, a Wellesley girl. The couple settled in Boston in a modest apartment hotel called Garrison Hall. For decades, Inman rarely left the building. He simply couldn't tolerate either noise or light.
He was kept from the world. He lived in this, in effect, in the darkened room with excursions from time to time on his various automobiles. He couldn't stand the sound of trucks going on his street. He wanted Evelyn to go down to the state authorities and ask him to cordon it off, or to allow him to put sort of straw on the streets to cushion the sound, so that it was a mania.
This is Arthur Inman, and he's sitting in the middle of a dark room and
While
holding
Inman hid from the noise and glare of the outside world, he filled his time recording hundreds of hours of conversations.
Here comes poor darling dear Evelyn with her poor back.
Yes, I know. Well, that's all right. I'm here. I'm still here yet.
He recorded hours of morose soliloquies.
all this pain, and it never ends. And when one pain stops, another begins. Can anyone in this world feel as alone as I feel?
Inman may have felt lonely, but he was far from alone. He would summon armies of people to his universe, doctors, specialists, workmen, and scores of young women who were hired to read to him and tell him about their lives. It often became intimate.
This is Paula, back from her trip to Lake Placid to see her boyfriend, Bud. Did he pet you nicely, Paula?
Oh, Artie, dear. You shouldn't say things like that.
Hundreds of people came to Garrison Hall over the years, and their stories became fodder for what was to be Inman's literary legacy, the Diary. Before he died, he put money in a trust so that one day the work would be published. Harvard University Press hired Daniel Aaron to handle the project.
I cursed myself after I embarked on this, and even would write angry letters to Inman, just in my own journal, cursing him out and describing my real feelings about him and how worthless I thought he was and how disgusting I thought he was.
Professor Aaron says, despite all the lunacy, the Diary does have artistic merit and historical perspective. But most of all, he says, it offers a devastating candor he in some ways came to admire.
I came to see him as a man who had his own kind of courage and his own peculiar genius. He would say things that few people would admit about themselves. He came to believe finally that he could become world famous, and he could do that simply by being absolutely honest.
Arthur Inman had a long list of people and things he despised. At the top of the list of all things, the Prudential Center. The Pru had been under construction for years and was just completed the year Arthur Inman shot himself. Some people say that's part of the reason he shot himself.
He said very early, if I'm going to die sometime, it's noise that will kill me. It's not the buildings that he hates. He's holed up, and he's in his bastion, and they're battering down that bastion, and he had to get out.
I'm lost, and I'm afraid, and I'm bewildered, and I don't know what to do. There is no end.
Arthur Inman never worked a day in his life. He lived off his family's vast fortune. Now, over the years, he purchased not just his own, but several other apartments at Garrison Hall so that he could literally buffer himself from the outside world.
And Anthony, inside his world, Arthur Inman carried on what can only be called a highly irregular love life.
Of all the peculiar aspects of Arthur Inman's life, perhaps at the top of the list is his history with women, especially his wife Evelyn, who agreed to marry this self-proclaimed invalid, a man who believed women needed to be dependent and docile.
I think that there was a time when he was testing her and their marriage at the beginning, when he felt that she needed discipline, and he would knock her knees with milk bottles and things like that, and he'd put her through all kinds of things.
Perhaps it's no surprise that eventually Evelyn hit the bottle.
Every morning Evelyn gets some Johnny Walker in her little pink glass, and she says it makes her feel better, and maybe it does.
It eliminates my frustrations. It makes me able to feel as though I'm doing just what I like to do.
You think she would have left him forever and not had anything to do with him. And that seems to me the strangest thing. Why Evelyn and other women retained an affection for him.
Nice talking to you.
And I love Betty very much.
And I love Artie very much.
And I think we've got lots to give each other.
And there were literally hundreds of other women who came into Arthur Inman's lair at Garrison Hall. Amazingly, it was Evelyn, his wife, who helped bring them there. She did it by placing small ads in the newspaper on behalf of her husband.
He would put in an advertisement that he wanted somebody to come in and read to him, and that he would pay them $1 an hour or more. And then if he liked them, they would become a part of his life.
I really like Betty very, very much, and she's awful sweet.
Quite often, Inman wanted more than reading and talking. Professor Aaron's assistant for 10 years, Libby Smith, spoke with dozens of Inman's women during the years she was helping research the diaries.
As the years go by, the girls get younger and younger and younger, and he was more looking to them for the affection that he wasn't getting anywhere else. He was a sexual man, but he was, to him, touching a young girl was much more to his liking than an actual sexual relationship with someone.
This is Saturday, and Nancy was all withdrawn, and she wouldn't sit on my lap, and she wouldn't pet me today.
He liked the fondling. He liked buying them fancy clothes. You characterize him as lower middle class, looking for a job, looking maybe from a broken home, certainly in need of money that he could give them.
One of the young women who showed up for work was Barbara Laplace, who at the time was a student at Wellesley College. Today she lives in Florida with her husband.
The job was reading or talking with this partially blind man. He asked questions like, did you love your mother? Did you love your father? Just all sorts of, have you got a boyfriend? It was strange, but when you're that young, if your mind is open enough, you aren't frightened. You're just, oh, this is interesting and different.
Inman never made any advances on Barbara. She apparently wasn't the right type.
He claimed that all he had to do was look at the girl and look at her face, and he could tell whether she was approachable or not. Meaning anything he felt like doing or having done to him.
While Arthur was feasting on love and affection from his girls, Evelyn found her solace in one of Arthur's doctors. Things turned ugly when Arthur got suspicious.
He was upset, but she was much more eager to spend time with the doctor. They'd take trips together, go out nature watching and so forth. Then it began to probe and to carry the suspicions that he had always harbored. Then it all came out, and she told him.
Things he would call Evelyn when he found out about the affair were just awful. But he said this is going to be an honest picture, and that's going to come through, I think.
This is just like a giant and rather unpleasant soap opera.
It really is, and from what we know is how things turned out. Evelyn lived for many years after Arthur Inman did, and people who know her report that she was much, much happier when she was on her own after Arthur was gone, and you can see why.
I can imagine. It doesn't sound like a very pleasant marriage there at all. All right, still to come. Inman in Hollywood. And next, keeping Inman's story alive, on stage and on screen. Arthur Inman loved a good story, and he loved the stories of hundreds of ordinary people who came to visit over the years.
But what about his story? Will it live on?
40 years after his death and 20 years after the diary was published, it would appear that Arthur Inman has not exactly met his goal of becoming famous. But that could change if Lorenzo Di Stefano has his way.
At times he's a great writer in the Southern tradition, a descriptive writer. Despite his racist attitudes at times, he had a great humanistic quality in him. He was a paradox.
Lorenzo has been fascinated by the Inman diary for years, so much so that he wrote and produced a play called Camera Obscura, all about the goings-on at Garrison Hall.
And I started on my own, with no rights or anything, just sort of cobbling together some scenario initially for a film.
In fact, Lorenzo still hopes to make that film.
Evelyn is a key person in this. She is also a heroine. She's a main character. Probably one of the most vivid depictions of a wife that you'll ever find. An odd mix of tolerance and revulsion for him.
In many ways, Lorenzo is picking up the Inman torch from Professor Daniel Aaron.
Would his life make a good movie?
I think it would make a wonderful movie, and I think it would make a wonderful soap opera, because you have these incredible characters that keep coming in and coming out again, all with their idiosyncrasies. Some of them are comic, some of them are grotesque, some of them are funny. So you could have a show of that kind. Just call it Garrison Hall.
A movie, a play, perhaps a television miniseries. Arthur Inman, Boston's oddball biographer of nobodies, may someday become a household name after all.
What he did was provide these other nobodies like himself a sense of immortality. These waitresses and shop girls and handymen and cab driver, this sympathetic feeling for the working man, even though he wasn't one of them.
This has become your life's work, if not your life's obsession, it sounds like there in some way.
But I've remained consistent in my belief that this is worth the trouble. His heroism is probably in that his stamina, that he believed in himself.
Professor Daniel Aaron stuck with the Inman Diary for a decade. He says during that time he got to know Arthur Inman better than anyone else before or since. And he says he is a better person for it.
I think if you read it and take the time to do it, something does resolve that is positive and fulfilling. I think you get a richness and a denseness about a certain side of American life that very few people have touched.
And it's getting closer and closer to the end, and the typewriter is banging and the wind is howling, and I'm getting very tired, and I guess I'll stop before it goes off the end. Goodbye.
Goodbye. This is the end of the record, Arthur says.